Hey guys, it's Danny. Welcome to another episode from our Orchid Care for Beginners series. Today we are going to discuss about baby orchid plants, or keikis, how they're known in the orchid hobby. Now, if you didn't know that even orchids can actually produce baby plantlets and be propagated, well, now you know. And actually, Phalaenopsis orchids, which are the most popular orchids, are known to create these baby plantlets. Now, in this series, we did actually talk about keikis, how they're different from seedlings and why the orchid produces them. So if you want to learn even more about keikis, do check the description. I'll link you to that video down below. Today though, I do want to focus on separating these baby plants and potting them separately, tell you when is the best time to do so, and pretty much the visual cues so you have success with your baby plant. Because if you remove it too early, you might have the bad surprise to actually lose the entire baby plant. So it is important how and when we perform the separation. Today's video, together with our entire Orchid Care for Beginners series, is sponsored, of course, by repotting.com, who offers you everything you could possibly need to properly care for your orchid. From potting mixes to pots, fertilizers, and all sorts of accessories, they have it all. Now, if you're into other types of houseplants, good news. They're actually starting to have more and more products aimed for other types of plants as well. So I'll be sure to link them down below in the description together with my personal favorite products. And a little spoiler for you guys, they have started to roll a little bit in the EU and in the UK on Amazon. I will be sure to come back with further information as I get it. Finally, the moment has come. It is a slow rollout. I think they will first start with the pots, but I will keep you up to date. Finally, it's happening. So yeah, just wanted to share that with you guys as well. So with that said, let's just start by showing you the two types of keikis that we're gonna separate today. The first type is the flower spike keiki, which is a baby plant that grows on one of the nodes of the flower spike. Now, these nodes can be the ones near the base and upwards before the flowers actually start, but they can also be the very top of the flower spike. That is a growth point as well. So keikis can appear from any of these nodes. They cannot appear from the nodes where the buds are coming from. And especially if the buds and flowers are spent, you will not get a keiki forming on one of these buds. These are spent growth points. So as you can see, what I'm showing you here is a baby plant that started to grow on the very tip of the flower spike. And mind you, this is not a very healthy orchid. It looks very dehydrated. And in this particular instance, it is the reason why it is trying to propagate itself, so it produced two keikis. But keikis can actually appear even if your orchid is not sick, so don't worry about that. But I really wanted to clarify and address this just so you don't get the impression that keikis only appear on sick orchids. The second type of keiki a Phalaenopsis orchid can produce is what we call a basal keiki, which is a baby plant that sprouts from the very stem or axis of the orchid. Along its axis or stem, the orchid does actually have growth points as well. Flower spikes are coming from one of those growth points. And of course, keikis can be produced from the very same points as well. Both of these types of keikis can be separated from their mother plants and potted separately and grow as a brand new plant. Now, this doesn't mean that a Phalaenopsis will always create both of these types of keikis at the same time. It can create either a basal keiki, either a flower spike keiki. But as you can see, it is possible to have both of them at the same time. Typically, it happens when the orchid is in trouble and it's desperately trying to propagate itself. As it just so happens, this particular orchid has a terminal spike. The crown is affected, so it is forced to propagate itself even though it's not sick and it has a very nice root system. But since the crown cannot create any more leaves, it has to propagate itself through a keiki, and this one chose to create a basal keiki, as you can see. Now, basal keikis don't necessarily need to be separated from their mother plants. They can coexist together in perfect harmony because the keiki will produce roots eventually as well. And since it is very close to the potting mix, it typically roots itself next to the mother plant, and both of the plants absorb water and nutrients, so the baby plant will not start to drain the mother plant of energy. So in the case of a basal keiki, it is absolutely fine, and it is your choice if you want to keep it in the same pot and attached to the mother plant, or you want to separate it. In the case of the flower spike keiki though, things are a little bit different because it is usually pretty far away from the medium, from the potting mix. It will not be very easy for this plant to obtain water. You will practically need to either mist it, either find a way to water this plant as well and keep it hydrated, otherwise it will pull the moisture and nutrients it needs from the mother plant. And that can be absolutely fine. You can have a very established and bushy and healthy orchid which can sustain the keiki, even if the keiki doesn't actually benefit from the same level of moisture. But there are cases in which the mother plant simply cannot take care of the baby plant anymore. This is the case with this orchid, so in this instance, I am pretty much forced to remove this keiki if I want to save it. So when is the best time to separate a keiki? Well, it has nothing to do with seasons or with the time of day. It has everything to do with the root system. An orchid baby plant needs to have roots in order to survive. Otherwise, if we separate it and the keiki doesn't have any type of root, it most probably will not make it. It still depends on the mother plant for nutrients and moisture. The rule of thumb usually is to have at least 4 even better roots that are about 4 to 5 centimeters long. That would be about 2 inches, in order to make sure that the keiki will start to absorb water and nutrients immediately, so it doesn't become dehydrated and fragile in the meantime. So as you can see, in this particular case, my keiki does actually have quite a few roots. They are quite long, and it's quite safe for me to remove this keiki, but let me show you an instance where it would definitely not be a good idea. So in the case of this Phalaenopsis, we can see that we have a little keiki starting to form right here. And if we take a close look, we can see that the keiki started already to produce very tiny little roots, but they're about barely half a centimeter long at this point. They are absolutely not capable to sustain this keiki. They cannot absorb water and nutrients at this point. So if we were to separate this keiki from the mother plant, chances of its survival are very, very, very low. The mother plant will be absolutely fine. It will actually be ridden of a burden, to be honest, but the keiki will not. So if you want to save keikis, let them root a little bit before you remove them. It is the exact same story with the basal keikis as well. There is really no difference in between these two other than the place where they form. If we separate them, they still need to have roots in order to sustain themselves. Now, before we move on to actually removing the keikis, another thing that I wanted to clarify, the size of the keiki will definitely vary depending on the type of Phalaenopsis you have. Typically, the flower shop Phalaenopsis will have pretty large keikis as well, because they are the type of Phalaenopsis which usually grows large. The two orchids that I showed you that have keikis are not in the same subgenus as the flower shop Phalaenopsis. So if your keiki is much bigger than this and still does not have roots, don't worry about it. It will eventually, 99% of the time, root out, and it doesn't have to be this tiny size. Alright, so now let's get to removing the keikis. First, you need a sanitized pair of very sharp pruners or scissors. In the case of a flower spike keiki, we don't need to unpot the orchid or do anything of the sorts. We can let the orchid be. All we need to do is cut the flower spike. Ideally, we need to cut the flower spike about 1/2 inch or 1 centimeter below its connection with the keiki. So mine is right at the very tip of the flower spike. If yours would be here, you would need to cut 1 centimeter or 1/2 inch above and 1 centimeter or 1/2 inch below. In this case, all I need to do is cut below the actual connection. Side note, it's not a good idea to try and twist the keiki or just rip it off, because you might actually rip part of the axis of the keiki, and that will be very bad. Better to leave on a little bit of the flower spike, which will dry up in time and will cause no harm to the keiki. So I'm going to cut this flower spike right here. And there we have the baby keiki. Again, a little side note, my keiki has some pest damage. That's why it has all of this weird grazing. But as you can see, it also bloomed in the past. And that's the good thing with keikis. They can bloom really fast. Unlike seedlings, keikis skip the whole growing up process and eventually mature very fast. And at this point, it can directly be potted. So choose a pot that can accommodate for the roots. In my case, a tiny little pot like this will be just fine. Keep in mind again that it will probably outgrow this pot sooner rather than later, maybe in a year or so, maybe even faster. You would have to remove it. Then use a potting mix adequate for epiphytic orchids and adequate for Phalaenopsis. But keep in mind that the roots on this keiki are not yet adapted to high levels of moisture. They are fresh and they will adapt very, very fast, but we need to make sure that the medium we prepare is still very airy. So in my case, I will go for a combination of sphagnum moss and bark. That is what works best in my environment. You might opt to go only for bark chips, maybe even only sphagnum moss, but you have to be careful that you don't suffocate the roots. And just go ahead and pot the orchid normally, just like you would a normal Phalaenopsis, placing medium around the roots and making sure that if you do indeed use sphagnum moss, that you don't press it down and compact it. And there you go, the orchid is potted. Now, when it comes to watering, and this is again very important for flower spike keikis, you can water this right away, but I would not advise you to actually soak the pot or make sure that the pot is always damp or anything of the sorts, at least for a month. And this is because the roots have grown in air. They have not adapted to high moisture environments. Since they are fresh and new, they will adapt, and the new growth they will put on will be very, very suited for the pot. But for about a month and a half, maximum 2, I personally think it's a great idea to try to harden off a little bit, if you will, the roots. Just run water through the pot. Better to water this more frequent than performing a soak, let it super saturate and then let it stay wet for another week. So in my case, I will just run a little bit of water through the pot. All I want is for these strands of sphagnum moss to be a little damp. The bark will not retain much water. It is fresh bark, it doesn't retain water. It's what I want for this keiki. In about a month or so, I can change it up, start to maybe soak it or run water a few more seconds through the pot, because the roots will slowly and surely get adjusted to the medium and to higher moisture levels. Right now, they're not adjusted at all, and keeping them soggy will not be to their liking. When it comes to basal keikis, more often than not, it is a great idea to unpot the orchid first, because if you try to remove the keiki while the plants are still attached, you might go with your scissors and actually cut the stem of the keiki if you don't properly see what you're doing. So again, if you want to save the keiki, better unpot the orchid, so you better see what you're doing, which is what I will do, because in my case, the mother plant is not healthy and it will wither off anyway. There we go. So I can much better see now where the keiki is attached to the mother plant. Now in this instance, we have a stem attaching them, but it is very, very, very short. I will give you a close-up. Usually, to better see what you're doing, you can try to pull the two plants gently apart just to reveal that stem. But basically, what we will need to do is cut that connection between the two plants, yet again, making sure that we don't cut the stem of the keiki or any of the roots. Alright, so as I was showing you the close-up, the mother plant came apart. It's okay. This plant suffers from stem rot. That's why I was telling you it is sick, so I am prioritizing the keiki. But I hope you could see that little stem that I told you about. So, right here. And there we go. I did a good job only using the viewfinder. I deserve a prize. I don't actually deserve a prize because I did manage to cut by mistake one root as well, but it's okay. I have a lot of roots left, and losing one root will not affect the keiki. And this is another reason why you should definitely wait for your keiki to produce multiple roots. By mistake, you can actually cut one of the roots, especially with basal keikis. So just wait it out. All right, I can actually better show you the stem that connected the two plants on the mother plant. There it is. This is the stem that I just cut. You see it? This is where your cut should be as well. And indeed, it's tricky. This is an advanced class, but it's not impossible. So for me, the mother plant is no good anymore. I can discard it. I will not pot this keiki in this pot. I need a slightly tinier one, so I'll come back when I find a pot. All right, so I found a suitable pot, and the potting medium will be, again, the same type that I used before. This is my preferred potting medium. And in the case of the basal keiki, there may be no need for you to harden off the roots, because typically, if the keiki is close to the potting medium, the roots, or at least some of them, have already started to grow in the medium, getting adjusted to the higher moisture environment. If that is the case, you really don't need to do anything special or harden them off, because obviously, they have already started to adapt to the potted environment. In my case, this keiki only had this root a little bit in the medium. All of the others grew on top of the medium. So I'm gonna do a bit of a mixture. I'm still not going to soak this pot or anything of the sorts. I'm going to make sure that when I water it, I don't actually have excessive water in the pot. So I will just run water through the pot for like 3 seconds or so, and that will be okay for about 2 weeks or so. And when I see the roots starting to grow inside the medium, then I can definitely start to water it a little bit more profusely. I will give the roots the best chance of actually adapting very, very fast to the potting medium from being quote-unquote aerial. And there we have it. This little keiki is potted as well. Some of the roots are not really going all that deep in the pot, and that is absolutely fine. They will find their way eventually. I'm not going to struggle to just push them in the medium. Whatever root was going down, it will still continue to do so. That is about it. I'm going to quickly water both of my keikis and come back for the outro with some final thoughts. When it comes to fertilizer, again, in the first month, it's not really all that needed because the roots are not really established. Sometimes you will discover that they will not even green up when you water them, or part of them will not do that. It's because they're too young to actually be able to absorb the water. So in the first month, there is absolutely no problem not to offer any type of fertilizer. We want the roots to be established and able to absorb water and nutrients. Otherwise, it's a waste. It can build up. It can damage the roots if it actually builds up. So after a month, you can start to fertilize. But again, we're dealing with baby plants here. Use a quarter strength or half strength, depending how strong your fertilizer is. Again, keep that regimen for a few months until the baby starts to grow bigger and bigger, which eventually it will. With good care in 1 year, it can be, if not almost as big as the mother, at least half the size of the mother plant. So take it easy. For a few months, less fertilizer is okay, but your keiki does need fertilizer. It cannot grow with nothing. It needs sustenance. Just dose it according to its size. The smaller the keiki, the less fertilizer it will require. The bigger and more foliage it has, the more fertilizer you can give it, close to what you would give a mature Phalaenopsis. So with that said, that is about it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed today's video and I hope you learned something new. Phalaenopsis will naturally grow keikis at some point in their life. When they will do so, the orchid will decide. However, there is a little bit of a trick that we do. We use some hormonal paste on a growth node. I will link you to that video down below in the description. This is typically how we play around with keikis and with propagation in cultivation. It's not 100% proof. Sometimes the orchid will grow flower spikes, sometimes keikis. But if it's something that sounds fun to you, just so you know, there is a product that can induce keikis and you have more information about it down below in the description. of course together with other tutorials that I've made in the series. And with that said, it is time to go. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you Repot.me for sponsoring yet another episode. Subscribe to my channel for more orchid videos, tutorials, experiments, updates, and other fun orchid subjects. If you wish to support the channel, do consider becoming a member or visit the merch store linked down below in the description. You can also follow me on Instagram and Facebook. It's always nice to stay in touch there as well. And with that said, I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Bye!